Welcome to the Public Policy Panel powered by the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum. We've got an exciting session planned, particularly well-timed, given India's position in the economy, its economic expansion. We have three renowned panelists, and I'd like to start with the first panelist, who I believe needs no introduction. Dr. Raghuram Rajan is... Yep. Sir, I promise you I'll keep this brief. Dr. Rajan is the Catherine Dussack-Miller Distinguished Service Professor of Finance at the Chicago Booth School. Wow, we have a few of them here. Professionally, in the past, served as a chief economist at IMF, chief economic advisor to the government of India, and of course, was an RBI governor. He's an award-winning author, published Fault Lines, The Third Pillar, and his latest book that released in December 23 called Breaking the Mold. He's won many awards, and I'd like to name a few. The Deutsche Bank Prize for Financial Economics in 2013, Euromoney's Central Banker Award in 2014, and was also named one of the most influential people by Time in 2016. His education background would make any Indian parent proud. An engineer at IIT Delhi, an MBA from IIM Ahmedabad, and he's also earned a doctorate from MIT Sloan. Thank you for being here, Mr. Rajan. Our next panelist is Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, who's an executive director at the IMF. Dr. Subramanian was the youngest chief economic advisor to the government of India from 2018 to 2021. A tough time during COVID, also a challenging time where, against doomsday predictions by most economic commentators at the time, Dr. Subramanian demonstrated a V-shaped recovery through seminal reforms. As an author, he's published path-breaking papers, and to name a few, the strategic blueprint for India to become a $5 trillion economy in 2019. As a writer, he's published Money, a Zero-Sum Game in December 2022. He's a distinguished alumni from his alma maters, from IIT Kanpur, IIM Calcutta, again, the youngest to receive these awards. He is a doctorate from the University of Chicago. Finally, but not the least, the moderator of the panel, Malachy. Malachy is the vice president of at the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum. Prior to joining US ISPF, Malachy has actually had deep experience in India and internationally. In India, he served as the US financial attaché, where he developed policy initiatives with the central bank, finance, insurance, capital markets regulators, and the private sector. Internationally, he served as a senior economist to the US Treasury. He's also been an advisor to the Asian Development Bank and the African Development Bank. Malachy's got an MPP from Harvard, an MBA from the University of Maryland, and has also got a BA in International Relations from UPenn. Gentlemen, we're looking forward to an exciting session. We have a lot of time. A lot of people have been looking forward to this. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and welcome to our panelists. Of course, it's a very hard act to follow. So to yes. Set a bunch of economists up after a world-renowned filmmaker is somewhat difficult, but we'll do our best. Luckily, we have some world-renowned economists here on the stage with us. So I want to start, though, given the audience and just given the tenor of the conference so far. I have noticed in the other sessions that there's been a lot of talk about sort of the journey that the various speakers have taken to where they are today. And I think that's especially useful for the students here. So I want to start just asking you briefly to talk about your journey from education into public policy and then to where you are today. So Dr. Rajan, why don't I start with you?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me here, and it's a great pleasure to be in these wonderful surroundings. What a day, what a beautiful scenery outside. Of course, while I'm from the school across the city, actually both of us are in some ways, very fond memories of Kellogg, and of course, Francesca is a dear friend. Look, everybody has their own journey. We heard Vidhu Vinod Chopra's, fantastic journey. What a great life he's had. Salient points. One was, why did I get into academia? It turned out, I graduated from business school, applied for PhD programs, and turns out I didn't get scholarships to any of the places that I really wanted to go. So I was planning to I had joined the Tata Administrative Service. I was planning to build a career there, and then some person, this is serendipity, turned down a scholarship at MIT, and so halfway through summer I got a scholarship. And I said, well, I could continue in TAS, or I could take the scholarship. I debated for about 15 seconds, and I decided to go. At that time we didn't have the kind of opportunities that you people have in India. This was before the liberalization, and really many of us, wanted to go out, see the world, but the only way to do it was to actually do an advanced degree. And my ambition was I want to get into the World Bank and become a super IAS officer. I love bureaucracy, so I wanted to become a bureaucrat in the World Bank. Well, academia tends to socialize you, and by the time I finished my PhD, the World Bank looked like a much dominated option. And I was planning to go to one of the second-tier universities or third-tier universities. Fortunately, I got into the University of Chicago, and then I was planning to get fired very quickly because it's important to work really hard and make tenure. Most people who go into top schools don't have any prospect of making tenure, and again, serendipity worked out. The next, I'll offer you two more thoughts on this. The next big sort of opportunity was, I suddenly got a call from somebody I knew who was at that point the deputy managing director of the IMF. And she said, I was a finance guy. The IMF is a macroeconomic institution. And there's no way a finance guy works for a macroeconomic institution. And so she said, hey, Raghu, do you want to interview for the job of chief economist here? I was shocked. I said, look, I'm a finance guy. I don't know any macroeconomics. She said, that makes two of us. That actually sold it to me, because Anne Krieger, who was the deputy managing director, is a very famous trade economist. And basically she was saying, look, we can figure it out. And I went and actually learned macroeconomics on the job. And it's not that hard. You just have to say, okay, this moves up, that moves down. Don't tell
where do the
anybody
lines
if you're
cross?
professors.
Right?
Yeah, somewhere lines cross. Actually, in macroeconomics, for those who know any economics jargon, the biggest issue is trying to figure out what's exogenous. And everything's endogenous, of course, and it's just what you believe is more exogenous than the others. At any rate, that was a very interesting experience. And then the third, the point here I'm trying to make is, look, life is about serendipitous occasions where something comes up. And the point is, do you pick it at that time, or do you say, look, I'm really comfortable and I want to go along with what I have? I mean, the third choice was really when a call came from India. We have the chief economic advisor position open. Are you interested? I really didn't want to be chief economic advisor. I wanted to be RBI governor. But that job wasn't open. As chief economic advisor, you're sort of advising the finance ministry, but you are part of the bureaucracy. You don't have as much freedom as I'm sure Subbu will attest from his. You can pontificate, but you're still an advisor. You're not really doing economic policy. But I went there, and it turns out the RBI governorship opened up, and sort of Prime Minister Manmohan Singh chose me. But 3 different occasions, 3 different choices, and fortunately, my job at the University of Chicago was always open. I could go, come back. That gave me a wonderful opportunity to experiment. But I think Mr. Chopra said something which was important, which is, everybody in this room has enough buffers that it's important you try. You try different things, you challenge yourself. Almost, if I were to give you a piece of advice, it would be, if you feel comfortable, try to make yourself uncomfortable doing something else. That's the way you grow. Let me stop there.
Please.
First of all, let me thank the organizers for inviting me. I think it's really nice to be here. I visited for 1 term here as a visiting faculty in spring of 2015, so it's nice to be back here in campus. And let me say, it's actually, a real privilege to be sharing the platform with my advisor and mentor, Raghu. So I'm really very, very privileged. For me, I would say my life has been essentially a series of fortuitous accidents. I come from a very lower middle class background. My father was for a large part of his life was a clerk in the Indian Railways, so 2 siblings. My father wanted one of us to be a doctor, another to be an engineer. And he somehow expected me, the elder one, to be a doctor. And around, I think, 8th or 9th, I figured that I actually was terrible at biology. My sons and my son and daughter still tease me about it. I'm still very bad at that. But I think I was good at maths, and so, it's a herd mentality. You're good at. So I thought I'd do engineering. And then, when I went to engineering, had something very opposite of what Vidubhanath Chopra was talking about. So at that time, because I thought I was good at mathematics, I wanted to do a PhD in mathematics. And then, there have been, by the way, actually, as I said, mentors like Raghu and other professors who actually played a very important role in actually shaping who I was privileged to become by giving inputs at very critical times. And I think he figured I wasn't good enough to actually to do a PhD in mathematics. So if he had said the way Vidubhanath Chopra saying you'd make a terrible math PhD, I might have possibly gone the same route. I'm going to show it to you, and maybe made a mess of myself. But he said it in a positive way. He said you seem to actually have a flair for speaking as well. So maybe think about finance, and made me meet his son who was working in JP Morgan at that time. He had come down in December. So I ended up meeting and then developed an interest for finance, and that's why I went into then the IIMs. Incidentally, I think the interest for economics actually happened because I was reading about the liberalization. I still remember, I was in IIT at that time, in the reading room, reading about liberalization. So I think the first sort of sparks of economics, I guess, came in then. And then, again, when I was at IIM Calcutta, another professor, this is a professor of statistics, actually, whom I respect a lot. He said that you should think about going into research. And he, I think, wrote a very good letter as well. And so then but I was not sure at that time whether I actually would be able to do well in research. As a tutor, I'd figured out that I was good at teaching. And so I wanted a softer option, went into, ICICI had a research group called Derivatives Research Group. I went there, spent a couple of years, and that's from there I applied for a PhD. And I still remember writing to Raghu when I'd gotten into Chicago and, a few other places. So then I came to Chicago, spent 4 years. I think one of the pieces of advice, he may not remember what he said, but I remember distinctly what he said. So this is the first time I go to meet him, in his room. This is actually the older building. It was actually Rosenwald And he tells me that one of the best parts of being at a place like Chicago is that you see greatness in flesh and blood. And when you see greatness in flesh and blood, you start believing that you can be, one like that as well. And that's the most important step. And I think that is indeed something that I've actually held very closely. I think that self-belief, and you start seeing, and lo and behold, actually, I remember one of the first classes, Gary Becker, and I was really literally pinching myself, a Nobel laureate, teaching us. And he would make mistakes as well on the board. And somehow, to be honest with you, actually, at that time, so I didn't think that Nobel laureates could make mistakes, but seeing them in flesh and blood, but at the same time seeing that passion. He used to be I think at that time he was close to 80. He used to be in his office at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he would say in class as well, I really want to sort of give out whatever is here to the next generation. I also used to hear he would play tennis with all the young assistant professors that came, even when he was. So I think that passion. So when I looked at people like him, people like Raghu, and I think what I learned was that it's when you're incredibly passionate about what you do, I think that really helps. And I think then hard work sort of becomes easy because work becomes play in some sense. And I think that's something that I've believed, that if you have to do anything in life, you have to work hard. I think it's such a simple formula. So that's how, and again, another, I was very clear. I actually wanted to do a PhD and go back to India immediately. At which point in time, again, so Raghu said that you should spend some time actually, here in the US, get some experience, and then go back. And that's how I went to ISB. And then I didn't go back to the Indian School of Business thinking that I would, contribute to policy. It happened when the chief economic advisor position opened up. I applied for it, went through the process, and yes, there were times when I actually, during those 3 years, I thought, so the very first meeting, when I, as a CA, was with Finance Minister Jaitley chairing it, was on the IL&FS crisis. We dealt with that, and then Yes Bank went into trouble. We dealt with that, and then cleaned up, the banking sector. And I thought I had my share of crises, and then the COVID struck. So, but I realized, I think that that it's a time where I learned a ton. Every time I would actually, so I'm being very honest, and sometimes I used to think about, am I going to be remembered as the worst chief economic advisor this country had? And then I would tell myself, that's okay, at least I would still be chief economic advisor. So what if the worst? And I would go and read, when I felt nervous. And learned macroeconomics on the job, as Raghu said. And I think reading a lot helped, I think, and just being hungry to actually learn. The other thing that I have felt and I've benefited a lot is, to think from first principles. When I was preparing for the IIT JEE, that's where I think the thing that I really picked up is, without any preconceived notions, without being sort of a victim of received wisdom, to try and figure things out yourself, actually from first principles. And I think that's something which has helped me a lot. It sort of, I think, brings a lot of clarity in your thinking, and doesn't make thinking circular. So that's one aspect that I guess I would share. The other aspect, I think, for me, I've failed a lot in life. And I think being able to embrace, I guess embracing failure is difficult, but being able to learn from failure, and I think not being afraid of trying. For instance, when I was actually putting in my application for the chief economic advisor, one of my, whom I'd worked with actually said, what are your chances? I said, I don't know. He said, I wouldn't put my hat in unless I was sure about my chances. But then I felt that's not the way I like thinking about it. The most difficult ones are oftentimes the one with low probabilities. And you have to actually try and, if you're willing to sort of take failure, and I think then you can possibly succeed as well. So that's the other aspect that I would share with you.
Thank you. So I think that those are both really, really important stories for everyone here to hear, the importance of taking risks, pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone, and of course, having a good mentor, being able to tap into the wisdom of somebody who has gone before you, gone down the same path before you, and taking advantage of that. And so I think those are those are very useful things to hear. Let's pivot now and talk a little bit about the economy. Economic growth in India has been quite impressive, fastest growing large economy in the world for many years now, several years. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the drivers behind that growth. And so I'd like to start with you, Dr. Subramanian, because you are closest to the government. Talk a little bit about sort of the thinking behind the government's strategy to grow the economy, to continue to generate that growth. And I know the IMF has just increased its forecast for India, and I think several others have as well, several other forecasters have as well. So something is happening, something is working. Despite the drop-off during COVID, the rebound has come back, and things are looking good. So talk a little bit about that, and then Dr. Rajan will ask you to opine on that same topic.
Yeah, so I think if we start with just sort of the top line numbers, after COVID, India has had consistently 7% plus growth. This year, the first quarter, the first 3 quarters, 8.2%, 8.1%, and 8.4%. So even if, in the fourth quarter, if growth is much lower than these 3 quarters, at even 7.3%, I think we will have 8% average growth. I'll be honest, actually, this has not surprised me. Back in September 2021, when I was doing some of the media interactions, that actually had said that India will grow at 7% plus, out of COVID. So let me take you back to some of the thinking, during COVID. So I remember, around March, April of 2020, I remember agonizing for weeks, trying to really diagnose, the crisis. As I mentioned, I like thinking from first principles. And one of the things that we all learned was that every crisis is a shock to demand. People's earnings get impacted. But what I remember agonizing about was that this crisis does seem to be different. I got the clarity later, but there was a period of sort of just trying to decipher that for the first time governments are asking people to stay back at home. That has to mean actually that has to mean something. What it is, it actually took me some time to figure it out. And then I think being a financial economist, sort of understanding of supply chains and how interlinkages, etc., and then overall the impact on production, actually, then I was able to figure out that this is going to be a big supply side shock as well. And I think that was a very important, aspect. Secondly, when the crisis struck, I actually, as I mentioned, there were times I would feel nervous and I would read, and I think, and I went and read a lot about the previous 2 crises, how we responded, the global financial crisis and the Asian financial crisis. Being in India and actually seeing the economy, one of the things I've felt, and I think in some sense sort of comparing with the advanced economy, is that frictions on the supply side is something, and maybe being a business school professor, sort of you understand the supply side, the production side. I felt that frictions on the supply side, I think, are far more salient in a country like India than in the US, possibly because of our socialist past as well. And when I was actually looking at what happened, during the global financial crisis, for instance, you had, double-digit inflation for 18 months, every month, with the peak being 18%, current account deficit, going close to 6%, fiscal deficit actually, as a proportion of peer economies at about 3.5 times, and then, the country becoming part of the Fragile Five. So when I then ran it through the conceptual framework, to me, it actually one of the realizations was that if you're going to do as a percentage of GDP, same amount as the US, I think because of supply side frictions, we'll get much higher inflation. So, that was one of the other aspect is that because as I felt there's going to be a supply side shock, the difference between demand and supply, is that, to combat sort of the shrink in demand, you can give money to people and people start spending the next day and, sort of demand comes back very quickly. But supply, on the other hand, actually takes time. You have to anticipate, and foresight is far more important because there's a much bigger lag. Which is why I think India implemented, a good mix of demand and supply side measures. I want you also to realize actually something that, which all of us who were, in policy at that time felt was that India entered the crisis with all the sovereign rating agencies, downgrading their outlook on India. And we were just investment grade. And the reason was because, growth itself was declining. It was a growth decline that actually brought about these declines in the rating outlook. And often what happens if that bad news is followed with more bad news, the sliding in the ratings outlook can lead to a ratings downgrade. And because we were actually just investment grade, that meant that if there was a ratings downgrade, there would be absolute capital flight. So not only did we have to get growth back, but we also had to make sure that fiscally we basically were far more responsible. So I think that was the sort of very tough tightrope walk that we had to do during that time. And that is why I think both the demand and supply side measures were important. Just to explain how. So the way we thought through was that, and I like using this, suppose you think about a situation where governments do nothing, like the laissez-faire. You have a shrink in supply, you have a shrink in demand as well. What you can do these mental supply demand curves. What you will see is that output will decline significantly because the decline in demand and supply sort of reinforce each other. But with price, on the other hand, they actually counteract, and therefore there won't be inflation. So that's the first scenario. Second scenario, if you just do a demand side, you bring back demand with a shrunk supply. What you get is, of course, you get a lower GDP decline, but you also get inflation because you actually have demand increasing on a shrunk supply. And in contrast, the third, and which is what India did, if you push back demand and supply both, then you get a much bigger kick on output because you're actually getting supply increase and demand or supply reinforcement and demand reinforcement actually, reinforcing each other on the output side, but at the same time not getting inflation as well. So that is why, the fact that India had actually much lower inflation coming out of COVID and also a once-in-a-century pandemic and the Ukraine crisis, despite that lower inflation is not, an accident. It is actually because of good thinking that in anticipation of this that led to. Just want to give you a flavor of the supply side measures. I think in the interest of time, one of the key things, as I said, we actually could not spend as much. And one thing so learning from previous crises was that whenever the fisc spends, right, you can't target very well because fisc, or the sovereign doesn't have as good information about whom to target. Now, if you think about actually the population, and mentally, I had categorized it into three buckets. People like us who actually neither suffered a liquidity shock nor a credit shock. In other words, we had enough money in the bank. We also didn't have a problem of credit. And banks would be willing to lend to people like us. But there's the two other categories. One category which actually suffers a liquidity shock, in other words, doesn't have cash immediately, but is not suffering a credit shock. In other words, if they get a loan, they'll be in a position to repay later. And the third category, which has both liquidity and supply side shocks. Now, the advantage of the financial sector is that it basically what we economists call, it's incentive compatible because we all care about corporates and individuals care about the credit rating. So if you are in a position to repay, you will repay. And, that granular information at the borrower level, the financial sector has, but the government does not. So what we basically did was we, gave loans to the, through the banking sector to, MSMEs, small and medium enterprises, and to the urban poor. While overlaying with guarantees. The reason those guarantees was important was without those guarantees, the financial sector wouldn't have lent. They would have only been willing to lend to people like us. But at the same time, by using the financial sector, those who would have otherwise sort of, strategically behaved, right, who had the opportunity to repay but, would still have not repaid, they wouldn't actually behave smart like that, over smart like that. And that's why. So I think use of the financial sector, the granular information, and also the leverage that financial sector brings. Another aspect, finally, was that, in the COVID year, tax revenues are very uncertain at that time. We didn't know how things are going to be. Spending far more would have actually led to the ratings, a problem. In contrast, by guarantees, actually the payment on that would come later only, when the economy would have improved. So the checks would come basically for payment later for the fisc. So that was also an advantage. advantage. And I think overall that helped. Incidentally, last point, there was a clamor for an urban Manrega at that time, because urban poor was badly affected. But, I'm glad actually that at that time we resisted that temptation, because that would create another entitlement. And, unlike the rural Manrega, which actually where wages are not very different, urban areas, there are lots of different occupations, and, it would also have led to the problem of reverse migration. And so, but we instead use this, lending through microfinance institutions with guarantees. So overall, what you see as growth, and with moderate inflation, India's inflation during this time was about 90% of historical average compared to advanced economies, which had about 2.5 to 4 times the inflation. The mix of this, the growth and the much lower inflation, is because of careful thinking. First, the diagnosis of the crisis, and then thinking through the solutions to the same.
That's great. Managing through a crisis like COVID wasn't easy, and certainly for a country like India that has to deal with such a huge population of rural poor as well, it's a real challenge. So, Dr. Rajan, let me hand it over to you and ask you maybe what are coming out of the COVID crisis then, and looking at growth in the years since and the growth in the decades to come. What do you think are sort of the drivers that India needs to focus on going forward?
I think it's first undoubted that India is the fastest growing country in the G20, and of course a lot is made of that. The question is, what do we need to grow at, and is everybody growing, even while India is growing within India? Poor countries grow very fast. And we are also the poorest country in the G20. So we are in the mode of catch-up growth. A lot of what is contributing to that strong catch-up is the government's sort of emphasis on construction. That's an area that is working. That's also drawing in a lot of steel, a lot of aluminum, and those industries are doing very well. So in that respect, we are getting growth. But if you look at growth of the countries we would like to be like, China, Korea, countries that grew, for a long time at very high rates of growth, at our level of per capita GDP, they were typically 2 or 3 percentage points higher in terms of growth. So yes, we're doing well with respect to the other rich countries, but relative to other countries at our level, we need to grow faster. Why? The Prime Minister has talked about India becoming a developed country by 2047. What does that mean? If you just do the basic math, it means that if you want to get anywhere near 15,000, 20,000, that's being a very poor advanced country, but 15,000 to 20,000 per capita income, you need growth rates which are more like 10%, 9, 10% per capita growth rates over a sustained period of time. And, that's tough. In other words, India is doing fine, but we really need to meet a stronger test at this point, which is, can we up our rate of growth, and how do we do it? Now, Subbu gave you a sense of all that is going well. And, he's from the government. I have to...
Not now.
I have to give you the opposite. And let me start by saying, one of the issues he pointed out too is inflation is so contained. I like to think it's contained because of all the work we did in the RBI, creating an inflation targeting regime, etc. But that's not quite the entire story. If we are growing so fast, I think our real growth is about 6.5, not 8.5. 8.5 has some fluff in it, which is the fact that our GDP deflator is 1.5% when actual CPI is 5%. So it's the way we try and calculate GDP. We can have a debate forever on what the right GDP number is, but I do think that there is some fluff in 8.5. But let's say we're growing at 6 to 7, okay? The big question is, why aren't we seeing inflation at this rate of growth? And one is we've got supply and demand exactly balanced. The other is to say what creates the kind of inflation when you're growing fast? You run out of supply. That is typically labor, and wage rates start going up. If you look at wage rates in India, they're not going up. Look at the place which employs the most people, agriculture. Real agricultural wages have been growing at 1% a year for the last so many years. In other words, there's surplus labor in agriculture. Look at a chart of employment. Where has employment grown in the last few years? Two places. Not manufacturing, which is the government's emphasis, not services, which was our strength. It's grown in agriculture. For a fast-growing country, for agricultural employment to grow is a travesty. Why do people find jobs in agriculture? It's low productivity. They should be finding jobs elsewhere. The second place is where the government has put a lot of emphasis, which is going well, which is construction. Construction and agriculture are the two places which are growing jobs. So another explanation for why we're not getting the kind of inflation that starts showing itself when we're growing so fast. I want to leave out the possibility we're not growing that fast. I think we're growing at 6 to 7%. But the rationale for that comes from the fact that we don't have a lot of employment. That the labor market, unlike this country where unemployment is 3.5%, the labor market is not doing well in India. Mm-hmm. And that gives you the reason why we have 20 million people applying for 60,000 jobs in government. Why every government advertisement attracts so many people, because we're not creating jobs. And that leads to my last point, and as an opener, I'll start. We have to ask why that's not happening. Why are people not getting jobs? And if you look at, take a place which is easy to measure, manufacturing growth. Where is manufacturing growth happening? It's happening in the it's happening in the capital-intensive parts of manufacturing. If you look at labor-intensive parts of manufacturing, in 12 out of 23 sectors that form the IIP, we're actually lower in production than in 2016. A lot of the damage was done during the pandemic. That in the pandemic, you saw a whole bunch of these industries shrink. Why it's not come back is partly a mystery to me, but there is a potential answer, which is that our demand also has not picked up strongly since the pandemic. One version of that is if you look at consumption growth, even in these GDP numbers, which I'm saying we could debate what the true number is, 3% consumption growth. Consumption is not growing strongly. And that is consistent with a middle to lower middle class which is not doing well. What's evidence of that? Look at four-wheeler sales, people like us, what they buy, passenger cars, going through the roof, has gone past the pre-pandemic levels. Look at two-wheeler sales. Two-wheelers are what the middle class drives. They have been growing really slowly for the last decade, but particularly they went up before the pandemic. They haven't reached their pre-pandemic levels. That's suggestive that there is a large part. So put all these together. Not enough employment, okay? The fact that we have consumption growth relatively low. The fact that where most people, Indians, earn their living, agriculture, wages aren't going up. All this suggests an economy which is two-faced. One is the face we all see, which we talk about in these conferences. Fantastic. India is China plus one. Apple is creating factories in India. That's all wonderful. The other face is there's a hurting middle and lower middle class, which is desperate for work, which is not getting that work. When does that side come to bite the first side? It comes from demand. If we don't have more incomes, and this is the last point, Mr. Piketty, famous for talking about inequality in the rest of the world, just put out a working paper which shows inequality in India has been going through the roof. We are worse in terms of how much the 1% get in terms of income. Worse in the sense that 1% get more than even South Africa, which had apartheid, and Brazil, which is often thought of a very unequal society. The top 1% in India, according to Piketty and his colleagues, earns 22.6% of income. So all this is suggesting that India has a growing problem, even while there are success stories. And I want to emphasize the success stories. There are many places where India is doing well at any point. There are fantastic entrepreneurs. All of you talked, when we talked earlier about all the entrepreneurship you see in India. That's true. That's real. There are great people doing great things in India. I met Srinath Ravichandran, who's actually creating 3D printed rockets from IIT Chennai. And he's going to launch 20-feet rockets, putting small satellites into space. There's stories like this all over in India. But there are also stories of the lower middle class and the middle class, which is desperately struggling. And unless we fix that problem, we can talk about how we fix that problem, we really are not going to get to that developed country status that the Prime Minister so desperately wants, which I think is right. It's a good ambition, but we need to do far more.
So, thanks. A lot to chew on there. I want to pick up on one point you made. You talked about manufacturing, and India famously, since '91, since the reform started in '91, India's growth has famously been driven by the services sector, and it's like there was a hollow, missing middle there in manufacturing. And it seems now that the government is making an effort to fill in that missing middle. It's part of the China Plus One strategy. Talk a little bit, maybe, Dr. Subramanian, maybe you talk a little bit about that strategy to encourage manufacturing, which can also play a role in addressing some of the concerns that you talked about the lack of employment for the people moving out of agriculture.
Of course, Raghu has some important observations. Let me add to some of these observations, give you another perspective. By the way, I'm not with the government currently. With the International Monetary Fund.
You're appointed by the government, Subbu. It's not the private sector that appoints you.
I do not have an obligation to actually go and sing from any hymn sheet that they give to me. So I have the privilege of being able to share independent
On a
thoughts.
point of question, can you be removed by the government?
I guess not till I finish my tenure now. But let's get to the. But I think the important let's look at the data again on the GDP growth. If you look at just these the first 3 quarters, the first quarter, as I said, 8.2% both in GDP and gross value added. And just to sort of rejig our macroeconomics, GDP is basically gross value added plus net taxes. Both of them grew at 8.2%. Okay. When you look at the second quarter, GDP growth of 8.1%. The GVA growth was 7.7%, not very far. It's only in the third quarter where GDP growth was 8.4%, where the GVA growth is 6.5%. There as well, actually, the contribution of net taxes, and I've looked at this. If you look at the buoyancy of net taxes, in India over the last decade, the median for that is 1.6. In other words, 1% growth, increase in GDP growth leads to 1.6% growth in, net taxes, and the mean is 1.8. So even that, and taxes cannot be fudged, right? On the deflator, and I think it's important to understand that the deflator is actually comprised of 2/3 wholesale price inflation, approximately, and 1/3 CPI. During this period, the WPI actually has been either in negative territory or has been very low because of base effects itself. The WPI grew very fast. So as a result, the deflator actually is low only because the WPI are actually contribution of that. So there is, at least to me, and I've actually looked at this carefully, there is nothing, a hanky-panky about the GDP numbers.
No, I wasn't saying hanky-panky. I was saying... I was saying, as a serious economist, you have to worry when the deflator is so different from the lived experience of people. When the deflator is 1.5%, when the actual CPI is 4 or 5%, and we can go into the whole problem of double deflation of profits. And
yes,
it's technical stuff you don't need to worry about. But it does all come at the same time. And so what I'm saying is these numbers actually look a lot higher than what would be the sustainable level of GDP.
I think, let me just add on the, I think on inequality, and we can, by the way, those of you who are interested, one of the chapters I had written in the economic survey looked at this entire, my predecessor had this claim that the GDP growth is overestimated. Those of you who are interested, the title of the chapter is GDP growth in India overestimated? No, with an exclamation mark. You can go and read it.
Now you don't need to read the chapter.
Let me just quickly on the inequality, and the latest data on the consumption, the per capita consumption expenditure that has come, I think that's also an important piece of data. There are articles actually that have questioned the methodology or the data that Thomas Piketty has. This one is a more comparable 2011-12 per capita consumption, expenditure versus the 2022-23. When you look at that, the inequality, both urban and rural areas, has declined. And by the way, let me say that, these are comparable because the survey, method that is used across both these surveys is, indeed the same. So if you look at the Gini, the urban Gini has declined from 37 to 32, and the rural Gini has declined from 29 to 27, which also actually suggests that there is, not necessarily as much, increase in inequality. If you look at the poverty numbers, and this is important as well because there has been a lot of emphasis on welfare spending reaching the last mile, and some of the savings on DBT, etc., is quite large. If you look at the head count of poverty, using the $1.9, which is basically per day per capita spending, in 2011 PPP dollars, the decrease in poverty has been from 12% to 2% over a 10-year period. And using a larger number, of which is $3.2, which is actually sort of a higher threshold, the decline has been even more drastic from 54% to 21%. Again, using surveys basically done by the NSSO, which actually, has. So on the aspect of jobs, and I think there I do agree with Raghu that India does need to create, a lot more jobs. And that is why I think manufacturing is quite important. By the way, this is an opportunity for me to actually pitch my forthcoming book as well, India at 100. So the subtitle is Envisioning Tomorrow's Economic Powerhouse. There is a specific chapter devoted to this, to this aspect. I think, if we have to have the entire, young population in India getting jobs, then manufacturing sector growth is very important. And here, let me share my perspective on why. I think Raghu, for instance, has written saying that, India, for various reasons, has missed the manufacturing bus. When I look at, what has happened, India in 1991 did the, product market reform, opened up its product markets. But when we talk about, economists talk about factor markets. When you think about a manufacturing sector firm, what does it need? It actually needs land. It needs labor. It needs capital, or to set up. It needs power. It needs logistics. It also needs to have good scale, optimum scale, so that the economists think about economies of scale, reduce average costs on each one of these inputs. And these are basically land markets. Actually, still continue to be very distorted. You have labor reforms actually, and I was part of the team that actually had the legislation passed. I think the rules need to be passed. Labor reforms need to happen. Capital, there's a lot more work that is required. But if you look at some of the improvements that have happened in logistics, because firms need to, a firm that manufactures something, let's say in Ghaziabad in Uttar Pradesh, needs to transport it to Mumbai. The logistics actually become very important. And some of the improvements that have happened through the infrastructure creation is starting to show there is actually some good green shoots on manufacturing, which tells me that this is not rocket science. If reforms essentially enable, much more competitiveness on each of these factor inputs. Because the fact is that every entrepreneur that wants to work in manufacturing, on each one of these 6-7 inputs faces anywhere between 15 to 20% higher costs. You accumulate those, the entrepreneur is looking at double the cost, and that way, they can't compete. So the failure on manufacturing has been really a policy failure, which has not done enough to actually take care of all these inputs. And the Make in India, and that's something that, those of us who actually have had the opportunity to work on these have been focusing on enabling each of these inputs to become more competitive. And when that happens, actually, India is still a very large country with a large labor surplus. We can still have, manufacturing, and that is important for jobs. If we have to have jobs, I think it is, manufacturing is really critical. Just last point on this, Harvard economist Danny Roderick, and we talk about this. There is this phenomenon of convergence, and I think, Raghu talked about, for instance, poor countries, grow. The evidence on convergence actually is, what we economists call, it is not unconditional convergence. In other words, it is not the case that every poor country indeed grows to become a rich country. In fact, if you look at, one just piece of evidence, you look at the Fragile Five in 2013. That set had actually India, Indonesia, South Africa, Brazil, and Turkey. Of that, if you look at the country, only India seems to be, everybody's talking about it. Brazil and South Africa have had actually real output declines. Turkey has actually faced hyperinflation. And you've also had, Indonesia as being okay. But, so in other words, growth is not guaranteed. It is not unconditional. Or catch-up is not unconditional. But what is critical, and Danny Roderick actually shows this very well, manufacturing sector growth, and he has a paper showing that when manufacturing sector growth happens, the convergence is indeed unconditional. In other words, it does not depend on the kind of policies or characteristics of countries. Therefore, I think growth of manufacturing is extremely critical, not only from a macroeconomic perspective, but also from the microeconomic perspective of providing jobs to our burgeoning youth.
Great. So I'm conscious of the time, and I want to make sure that we have time to take some questions from the audience. But before we do that, let me give you an opportunity to respond to anything briefly. Well, but also, I'd like to get your views too on, right, given this is an election year, I'd also like to get your views on the importance of democracy to the economy.
Okay, very quickly. I don't disagree with anything that Subbu has said on the importance of creating the environment for growth, which means fixing the underlying infrastructure, fixing the environment, doing business, etc. But very important, which I think is part of the answer, is fixing our human capital. We absolutely need to do much more in educating our people, in skilling our people, in getting the kind of R&D which rich countries have, by improving the quality of our universities. I mean, one of the issues is that none of our top universities is in the top 100 in the world. If we are to get the kind of R&D that we need, I talked to Yusuf Hamid, who's the founder of Cipla. Not founder, he made Cipla into a household name in generic drugs. And I asked him, why don't you actually make drugs that are innovative? And he said, really the problem is that nowhere in the world do the pharmaceutical firms really innovate. What they do is they pick up stuff from the universities, from smaller firms, and then develop them. And the problem in India is the universities don't do enough original research in the pharmaceutical area. If they did, we would have a really strong pharmaceutical industry. So that's one example of why India needs to do a lot more. So my point is not so much that we should not have manufacturing. I disagree with Subbu that it's essential at this point to have a manufacturing sector in order to create jobs. The service sector has been creating plenty of jobs. People think about the service sector and they think about, software programmers. That's not where the bulk of the service jobs created by the service sector are. Many of them are retail jobs. The fastest growing job category in India was security guard. Now you may say, security guard, what an awful job. But it's a step up from being the 50th person on the farm and having a small plot of land which is totally unproductive. Being a farm worker and earning minimal, less than minimum wages. So the beauty of moving to the city and becoming a security guard is your kids go to a better school. And as they go to a better school, they get that education, which allows them to leap from poverty or lower middle class to upper middle class. And there's so many examples of people who've done that. So what I would like to see is we focus on improving the fundamentals and not put our bets on it's going to be manufacturing, it's going to be services, it's going to be construction, but let it happen. Every time we've picked a sector to win, it hasn't won, simply because we're trying too hard. This is why Gurcharan Das wrote a book saying India grows at night. It grows when the government is not looking. Because the moment the government starts looking, it starts messing around. What I have a problem with in the way we are approaching manufacturing today, right? We should be attracting a lot of flows, the China plus one flows. Apple will come because we're a big market. Apple will come because they need another place to manufacture than China. Do we have to load them with a huge number of subsidies? Do we want a top quality university, or do we want to subsidize somebody to make chip foundries in India? Some bureaucrat got the idea that chip foundries is where we should be. So we're spending $10 billion building chip foundries in India. Now, these are not going to make state-of-the-art chips. For that, you need much more money. These are going to make 28 nanometer chips, which basically are run-of-the-mill chips. The hope is this catches on. But of course, even Intel is asking for huge subsidies to make state-of-the-art chips. So what we've done is created a subsidy-consuming industry, which is going to want more and more subsidies as we go to the frontier. $10 billion, that's enough to fund 10 top universities at a huge scale, right? I have been associated with a couple of universities. We don't have enough money to buy spectrometers in some of those universities. And these are well-funded universities. Why is the government throwing money into chip plants when we could put money into science and technology in our universities? The IT minister says proudly we have 300,000 designers for chips. I say more power to that. Those guys came up without any government support, because we had good universities like the IITs. We need many more of those. We need to get many more kids into those. But first, they have to have good education right at the beginning. So, broader point, and I'll stop here, is that India needs to figure out where it needs to do its homework. And sometimes all the hype, and I made this statement elsewhere, and it got taken out of context by the troll farm, which is wonderful. I love the troll farm. The point was, if we don't do our focus on the fundamentals, if 75% of the kids in third grade can't do math at the second grade level today, they will drop out of school. These are the kids who are going to form the labor force of 2047, right? 20 years from now. If those kids haven't been to school, what kind of developed country are we going to have? What kind of inequality are we going to have? What kind of development chance are we going to have? So let's celebrate Apple coming to India. Let's celebrate all the people who say India is doing well. But let's not get swayed by that and stop doing our homework, which means focus on the schools, focus on the education, focus on nutrition. 35% malnutrition means we're worse than many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, how do we become developed when these kids are going to have stunted bodies by 2047? In other words, let's not look at the dark side and say, oh, we shouldn't look at this. We should only look at the bright side. There is a dark side to India also, which we need to fix. And that is why we need to have open debate. That is why we need to have criticism. That is why we need democracy, to give the government a sense that it's not doing the right thing. When the government suppresses criticism, when it asks for the media to always clap and never ask questions, what you get is a path which leads to dark places, not upwards. What we want for the kind, I think India is capable of tremendous growth over the next 20 years. But it desperately needs to do more homework. It needs to learn from the successes internally, and not all the successes are in government-ruled states. They're also in opposition-ruled states. Tamil Nadu is attracting Taiwanese shoe manufacturers into Tamil Nadu without a huge amount of subsidies, without a production-linked incentive system. Why is that working? Let's try and figure it out. So let's try and figure out what works in India, and I think we'll have a wonderful economy.
Great. So we'll do a few questions. Okay, so we're going to take a few questions. We'll try to keep it brief because we are conscious of the time. I'm going to hand the microphones around.
Hello. Hello, sir. Thank you so much for joining. My question is on your point of the inequality between the middle class and the rich class growing. I understand from your last couple of statements that it's mostly tending to education and nutrition that can help us fill this gap. But I read a lot about government schemes, micro lenders coming in to help small businesses, free rations, affordable housing. Do you think we are not doing enough, or we're not doing enough in the right direction?
Well, we need to do more. We need to think about how to do it, of course, but we need to do more, right? So, for example, you talked about transfers, okay? Transfers, if well targeted, can be very helpful. If that poor family can have better food, if that poor family can send its kids to better schools, you're setting them on the road for development, you're setting them on the road to invest in themselves, and that's going to generate growth over time. On the other hand, of course, there are places where, as Subbu correctly pointed out, you have to also be fiscally responsible. You can't create a macroeconomic disaster while trying to deal with the microeconomic problems of different places. So you have to balance this in a way that makes sense. Keeping the macroeconomy reasonably stable, can you try and target flows at people who desperately need it in order to improve their own capabilities? In the long run, that's going to make us much better off.
Good. All right, let's take one over here. How about in the back there? Do we have them? Yeah. Okay, go ahead if you have the microphone.
Hi, thank you so much for this amazing discussion today. My question is actually around, I'm just curious about your POV on the importance of independence of central bank from the government. And this might be a leading question, but the lines have been blurring recently, at least in my opinion. What is your perspective on this? Is it important in some situations? Like
I'm glad I actually get to also share my perspective on. Let me give you some data on this entire democracy and economy debate. In 2016, there were 450 startups. Now there are 100,000 startups. In other words, startups have grown at a CAGR of 220% during a period when a lot of the media here actually talks about apparent sliding in democracy. During a time when take the previous 10 years, 2004 to 2014, when according to the same media, democracy was in prime shape, startups were growing at 3.8%. And we all know, and economists definitely will agree, that startups are one very important sign of the vibrancy of the economy because they capture creative destruction. 220% growth every year during the last 10 years versus 3.8% during the previous year. Not just that, take innovation, the Global Innovation Index, and this is not government data. This is, again, international data, right? Even the data on startups I mentioned, actually, World Bank data. Global Innovation Index, we were ranked 78 in 2015. We're ranked 40th now. So I think the conceptual idea that free thought is important for innovation, I don't think that is something that is being disputed. But the measurement of democracy or the lack of it, what we have is basically poorly paid, bored postdoctoral researchers sitting in some nook and corner of New York.
Subbu.
Let me finish that.
Subbu, you cannot get away saying this. You cannot get away saying that democracy is stronger in India today. Every single index, now you say these are foreigners. You like foreigners when they praise you. You dislike them when they say you're not doing well on democracy. But every single index of democracy outside shows a decline in democracy. Let me tell you a personal experience. A newspaper journalist who used to interview me says, I'm no longer allowed to interview you. Why? Oh, my boss has got the order from the government. Don't interview him. I mean, this is personal. And it happens again and again. How many people who were independent journalists have been driven out of their you may say they're not so good, therefore they were driven out. Ravish Kumar is out. Take Karan Thapar, out. Karan Thapar told me that his sponsor was actually, went to the government to get something done. Said, oh, you're sponsoring Karan Thapar, stop sponsoring him. So, I mean, this is a government which does not like criticism. This is a government which has frozen the Congress party's funds, tried to freeze it. Fortunately, the Supreme Court intervened. This is a government, which puts the primary opposition leaders in jail, and this is a government which gives people a choice. Join us or go to jail. I mean, come on.
Let me. So let me also share some important perspectives here. I have personally worked, with this government, and I can tell you, have had the privilege of working very closely with the Honorable Prime Minister, one-on-one meetings. In private, I've actually had the opportunity to tell him things that he needs to improve upon. I've always been, and by the way, again, I'm being absolutely honest, not on a single instance was I told to go and say anything. I firmly believe in the policies that this government does, and that is why I would go and, I support. Even now, it is not because of, from the kind of background that I come from, if I don't remain the ED tomorrow, I don't care. But I actually will, go and say things out of my conviction. And out of my conviction, let me also then point out data here. The same, we all know about the Pew Economic Research. The Pew Research actually did a survey of people, about their religious beliefs and their ability to practice religion. What does that survey show? And this is basically without any pressure. 90% of minorities, in India say that they're absolutely free to practice religion. Also a counter perspective that has to be kept in mind. Another, let me give you data on actually democracy. So, let's look at the data on governments that have been, dismissed by central government, state governments that have actually been the Article 356. Under Jawaharlal Nehru, 7 state governments were actually dismissed. Indira Gandhi dismissed 49 state governments. Rajiv Gandhi dismissed 6 state governments. PV Narasimha Rao, who actually we all remain grateful for liberalization, dismissed 11 state governments. Manmohan Singh dismissed 11 state governments as well. And what is the number for the number of state governments that have been dismissed by Atal Bihari Vajpayee ji and and Prime Minister Modi? 0. Both of them.
Yeah.
So let me finish.
Subbu, because just when the moment is ripe, you don't have to dismiss them. You convince them to come over to your side.
I'm sure, Raghu. Let's. I'm sure there have been enough cases. We have a judiciary, and and I'm sure we can talk about cases which have not necessarily been, gone the way that any particular party would like. There have been cases on both sides. The judiciary may be slow, but the judiciary is a very, very independent one. In fact, that's an aspect that gets talked about as well. The judiciary appoints itself, and doesn't have any. I'm sure we can talk about the electoral bonds if you want to, I think when you have a judiciary that can go and question And in the instances that we're talking about, neither of us know the specific details here, but the particular opposition leader that we're talking about, has also, there is actually possibly evidence. I think the verdicts will come about. But I don't think, this is an opposition leader that came on the pretext of actually rooting out corruption. And what we see now is actually something absolutely different. I've been completely disillusioned because at a point in time I thought, people like us actually could contribute. And, seeing someone like that actually, falling from grace is something I think, are we going to sit here as economists, go and defend people, basically do stuff like that and say, oh, this is vendetta, when there may be actually, absolute corruption that has been indulged by them? I think that's something we have to, irrespective of our political affiliations, we have to let the law take its own course, which is happening, in India. I think in this country as well, if for instance, let's say there's something that happens against the current, the previous president, would that then be said that, oh, it's basically the current incumbent who's basically going after? No, it is a law taking its own course. The same thing happening, in India as well. So I think we have to be, a far more balanced, in my opinion, in evaluating some of these aspects. As I think all of you can see that there are clearly, two perspectives here. I don't think, and let me be absolutely honest and acknowledge that I think the truth lies clearly somewhere in between. I think, and we have to be wise enough to acknowledge that. One of the aspects that has happened, and this is something that actually disappoints me, is that, because of the social media as well, many of us ourselves actually are, sort of putting ourselves into echo chambers. And we only we look at the messenger and thereby just basically, interpret the message, whether we want to like it or not. And I think conversations like these, especially, and I must mention, as I said to start with, Raghu has been a mentor and actually my advisor as well. I respect his beliefs. Actually, by observing him, I've learned a lot as well. But there is a different perspective, and that perspective, let me be very clear, that perspective comes out of conviction, not out of any desire for any future office or any other perks. It comes out of absolute conviction. I hope I have been able to convince you about that.
Good.
Okay, we have time for one more question. And I think, all right,
Dr. Rajan, I have one question.
Parag's taken the mic.
Oh, sorry. So we have talked about ideas from both the government and opposition. There's a dangerous idea right now being floated in India regarding redistribution of wealth. Do you endorse it? Do you have any views on it?
So I'm not the opposition. I like to emphasize that I'm an academic, and academics have a duty to criticize what they don't see as working well. Both sides, right? So that's what I do. Look, I think what we need to do is level up rather than level down. And I think for that, we need to figure out how we get the people who are not doing well to actually do better. And that will increase growth. Having inclusive growth will actually increase the pace of growth. And I'm not saying we should, tax the wealthy to a huge extent or anything of that sort. But I think we need to examine how we can get the part of the economy which is not benefiting right now, which has suffered a K-shaped recovery. You can't deny that when you look at the numbers since the pandemic. How do we get them flourishing? Because the cost of not doing that is first wasted resources. We have so many minds which are not contributing to India's growth. But more important is it could lead to more social conflict. Look at what's happening in Manipur. What's happening in Manipur is not a fight between two communities. I mean, that's what it's represented as. But it's also a fight for jobs, for reservations, because one community is seen as getting more of that than the other. If we have joblessness of the kind we've seen, we lose that population, that demographic dividend we've been talking about, but it becomes a demographic curse. Much more fighting about the pie rather than growing the pie. So we absolutely need to work on that. And I would say let's try and elevate rather than bring the successful down.
Good. Thank you. I think that's a good point. Going to take it, Andres?
Let me just, I think as I was mentioning earlier as well, India does need to work on, creating more jobs, and I think manufacturing and services both are important. But let me also point out a couple of, important facts here. This is from the ILO report, the PLFS, survey. If you look at the employment that is created, again, let me say there's actually more to be done. I'm an impatient guy. I want to do more, far more. But at the same time, I think it is important to have a balanced perspective. If you look at the total employment, I'm comparing data from 2012 versus 2022. Regular employment, these are people who actually are, earning a wage or are salaried people. That has increased by 35 million. The number of casual laborers actually has decreased by 17 million. Okay. When you look at the proportions of employment, regular has increased from 18% to 23%. Casual labor has decreased from 33% to 25%. So it is not all bad news, on employment. There is good news as well. That doesn't mean that there isn't work to be done. As, Swami Vivekananda absolutely said, the miles to go before we sleep. I agree with that. There's a lot more work to be done, but it is not all bad news. I think we also have to focus on, many of the areas where actually there's been good work that's being done as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think that's a good note to end on. Tremendous progress, a lot of work still to be done, and I think that's the takeaway of the India story. Thank you both. I think everybody got their money's worth today.